the dying light of Salvation Valley, where the earth itself remembers every drop of blood it has tasted, one act of kindness changed the fate of 3 worlds forever. It began with a widow's hand reaching out to a dying stranger in the dark. No questions. No fear, only the simple human refusal to let life slip away. What returned to her doorstep was not gratitude, but 30 wild Mustangs, a hidden spring, and a debt so heavy that the land, the horses, and the ancestors themselves would never forgive its weight. This is the story of a mercy so pure it became a wound no one could heal. The sun had bled out over Salvation Valley, leaving the sky the color of old tin. Clara Hayes stood at the splintered fence line, where the earth still held the shape of a man's collapse. No wind now, no birds, only the slow creak of dry wood settling into itself. She looked down. There it was again, the faint rust-colored print of a hand palm open, fingers splayed like something pressed into clay and forgotten. Not fresh blood, not talons anymore. The ground had remembered it, pulled it back up through cracked skin the way a grave sometimes heaves a bone after rain. The print lay exactly over the shallow carving Eli Boone had made years ago, their joined initials inside a rough circle, a promise scratched with a knife tip on the day they claimed this place. The drought had worn most of it away. Only the handprint remained sharp. Clara's breath came shallow, measured. She did not flinch. She did not speak. But her eyes stayed on the mark longer than a sensible woman would allow. She knew what it meant, even if no one had ever told her the words. Mercy had crossed a line drawn long before white folks arrived with maps and deeds. A life taken from death's hand and given back, carried weight the land did not forget. Far off, a single red-tailed hawk circled once, twice, wings set against the dying light. It did not cry out. It simply watched. She crouched, knees pressing into dust that smelled of iron and old hay. Her fingers hovered above the print, close enough to feel the faint warmth still trapped in the soil. The ground seemed to breathe under her touch, once very slight, like a horse's flank after a long run. She pulled her hand back as though burned. Behind her, the cabin waited, door half open, lamp unlit. Inside were the things that still belonged to Eli, his rifle above the mantel. The daguerreotype of their wedding day. The chair he favored, because one leg was shorter, and it rocked when he thought too hard. All of it had felt like shelter once. Now the house felt like a witness. Clara rose slowly. Her shadow stretched long across the yard, thin as fence wire. She looked east toward the blue bruise of mountains where Talon had ridden away on Rusty, with 30 wild horses trailing like smoke. No dust on the horizon, no hoofbeats. Only silence so deep it pressed against her eardrums. She turned back to the print. For a long moment, she stood motionless, the way a person stands when deciding whether to step over a rattlesnake or wait for it to move first. Then she reached down fingertips, brushing the edge of the handprint just once, deliberate. The soil gave the smallest tremor, as though something beneath had stirred, and then gone still again. Clara straightened. Her mouth tightened into a line that might have been resolve or simply fatigue. She walked toward the cabin without looking back. The hawk completed its final circle and tilted away toward the dark line of the foothills. 3 points of light now steady as eyes, watching a wounded animal. Clara's breathing stayed even shallow through the nose. Her heart knocked once against her ribs, then settled. She had faced coyotes at the henhouse fever in Eli's last day's drought that took everything but the bones of the place. This was different. This carried badges and orders and questions that could not be answered with a rifle or a prayer. She thought of the handprint outside, still waiting in the dust. Thought of Talon riding east on Rusty with 30 wild horses, trailing him like a promise she had not asked for. Thought of what would happen if these men found even one hair from an Apache pony in her corral. The lanterns shifted. One detached moved forward 100 yards, then stopped again. A man's voice carried on the still air. Low measured the way a marshal speaks when he wants to be heard without shouting. "Mrs. Hayes, we need to talk about some horses." The words hung a long moment, then sank into the night. No answer expected. Not yet. Clara remained motionless. The knife in her fist did not tremble, but her thumb traced the curve of the blade once slow, as though reminding herself what it was for. From the ridge, the owl called again, 3 short notes. Closer this time. The lantern light began to drift nearer slow as rising water. Hooves resumed their patient cadence on the hard ground. Clara exhaled once very softly. She stepped back from the window and pressed her shoulders against the rough log wall. The darkness inside the cabin felt thinner now, less like shelter and more like a held breath waiting to break. The first light came thin and cold, scraping along the ridgeline like a dull blade. Clara saddled Willow before the sun cleared the eastern mesas, the mare's breath steaming in short, patient clouds. She rode north without hurry, reins loose, letting the dun pick her own footing through the brittle grass. The Mustangs were scattered across the shallow basin ahead, dark shapes against the pale earth heads low grazing what little remained. She saw the circle of stones first. Small, knee-high, laid out in perfect symmetry, the way Talon had once shown her, without words, a place where the spirits of horses could rest between runs. The stones had been toppled inward, 1 or 2 rolled clear. In the center lay a torn scrap of blue wool cavalry issue coat, lining frayed where it had caught on rock, and a single eagle feather shaft snapped halfway, vein bent at a sick angle. Clara reined Willow to a halt. The mare's ears flicked forward, then pinned. Storm lifted his head from the far side of the basin black coat, catching the new sun like wet obsidian. He did not move closer. None of them did. She dismounted slowly, boots sinking into dust that smelled of dry sage and old manure. The air was still no wind to stir the broken feather. Clara crouched at the edge of the circle, close enough to see the faint boot print pressed into the soil beside the wool scrap, larger than Talon's heavier. Harlan Crow's mark, or one of his men's. She did not touch it. A prickle ran along her neck. She looked up. Old White Feather stood on the low rise to the north, half a mile off, motionless against the sky. No blanket, no rifle, only the silhouette of a man who had outlived more winters than most. He did not raise a hand in greeting. He did not come closer. He simply watched. Clara's throat tightened. She had never spoken to him before, never needed to. Talon had carried the weight of words between them. Now the old man's gaze felt like a hand laid flat against her chest, steady, unyielding, asking nothing and forgiving nothing. She glanced back at the Mustangs. Storm had shifted his weight ears still flat. The others milled tighter flanks, brushing flanks, a low murmur of unease passing through them, like wind through dry corn. When she whistled once soft, the way Talon had taught her, Storm took one step, then stopped. His nostrils flared. He scented the wrongness in the air in her, in the broken circle. Clara's hand hovered over the nearest stone. She could set it right. Stack them again, place the feather carefully, try to mend what had been torn. Or she could leave it as it was, walk away, pretend the circle had never mattered to her. Pretend she had not accepted 30 lives on credit from a man the army wanted dead. Her fingers closed into a fist. She lowered her hand. Old White Feather took one step forward, then another. Not fast, not threatening, just enough to close half the distance. When he spoke, his voice carried clear across the still morning, low and rough as gravel underfoot. "Woman, you have touched what is not yours." He said nothing more. He turned, blanket trailing faint dust, and walked back the way he had come. The Mustangs watched him go. Storm's head lowered a fraction, as though a weight had settled across his withers. Clara remained kneeling beside the broken circle. Her palm rested flat on the nearest stone, cool, rough, unmoving. She did not lift it. She did not speak. The sun climbed higher, burning the chill from the air. But the shadow old Whitefeather left behind stayed long after he had vanished over the ridge. Somewhere in the basin, a young colt nickered once uncertain. No one answered. The sun rose blunt and pale, stripping the night's chill without mercy. Clara stood alone at the broken stone circle, the basin still shadowed while the higher ground caught first light. She had ridden back before full dawn, Willow's hooves muffled on the frost-hardened ground. The mare waited now a dozen paces off reins, trailing ears pricked toward the north. Clara knelt again. The tumbled stones lay like spilled bones. She reached for the nearest one, flat sun-warmed already, and set it back into the rough ring, aligning it by memory of how Talon had once paused here. Silent, letting the horses drift past without word or whip. Her fingers brushed the snapped eagle feather next. The vein was twisted, the quill cracked clean through. She lifted it carefully, as though it might bleed. Her hand shook just once, a small tremor she could not stop. She placed the feather in the center barb up the way she thought proper. Then she hesitated, palm hovering. The wool scrap from Harlan Crow's coat still lay there, blue thread unraveling into dust. She did not touch it. A low murmur carried on the thin air. Clara looked up. Across the valley floor, a small group moved, perhaps 8 or 9, walking in loose file. Women in long calico skirts, children clinging to blankets or skirts, an old man with a staff bringing up the rear. They were crossing from west to east, skirting the basin as though it were marked ground. One boy, no more than 7, pointed toward the circle. His mother turned his hand down, gently shook her head once, and pulled him along faster. The others did not look back. They simply lengthened their stride. Old Whitefeather stood separate on the rim of the rise blanket, folded over one arm. He had not followed the group. He watched Clara the way a hawk watches a rabbit hole, patient, unblinking. She turned back to the stones. Ember had drifted closer during the night. Now the russet mare stood at the edge of the circle, nostrils, wide head low. Clara made the soft cluck Talon had used. Ember lifted her head ears forward for a heartbeat, then pinned them flat. She backed one step, then another, flanks brushing Storm's shoulder. The black stallion did not move away. He simply stood watching Clara with the same steady regard as the old man on the hill. Clara's throat closed. His throat. She reached toward Ember, once palm open. The mare did not come. She lowered her head to graze instead, but the motion was stiff, deliberate, as though choosing distance over trust. Clara set one more stone. Her fingers left faint dust on the surface dust, mixed with the tiny barbs from the broken feather. She stared at her hand a long moment, then wiped it slowly on her skirt. The stain remained. Old Whitefeather turned. He did not hurry. He walked toward the file of his people staff, tapping once, twice against the earth. The group waited for him without speaking. When he reached them, they resumed their way east, shadows stretching long behind them. Clara remained kneeling. She let her hand fall from the last stone she had placed. The circle stayed unfinished, one gap wide enough for a man's foot to step through. She looked down at her palm, a faint gray smear eagle down, clinging to the creases like ash. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. The words barely stirred the air, the Mustangs shifted. Storm took the lead without sound. They began to drift east, slow, unhurried, following the line the Apache had taken. Ember went last, glancing back once. Then she was gone over the low swell of ground. Clara stayed where she was until the dust settled. The sun climbed higher. No wind rose. No bird called. Only the faint creak of willow shifting weight behind her, waiting. The ride to the hidden canyon took the last of the morning cool. Willow moved sure-footed through the narrow draw hooves, scraping against a red rock that still held the night's chill. Clara kept her seat loose, reins slack, letting the mare choose the path she had learned by heart. No birds sang in the slot canyon. Only the faint drip of water somewhere deep inside the stone mocking. She rounded the final bend and pulled Willow to a halt. The entrance to the grotto was gone. A rough pile of boulders blocked the narrow passage, fresh work edges sharpy, where they had been rolled or levered into place. No slide of loose scree, no natural tumble. Someone had stacked them deliberate, shoulder high, sealing the way as tight as a grave. On the largest stone at eye level, someone had pecked a single mark, a crossed circle with a downward slash, the Apache sign for forbidden ground, for water that must not be taken. Clara dismounted. Her boots crunched on grit. She laid a palm against the lowest boulder. It was warm from the climbing sun, but underneath she felt the faint vibration of running water steady alive, just out of reach. The sound came muffled through the rock, a low gurgle that promised life and withheld it at the same time. She sat down hard on the dry earth, back against the pile. Dust rose around her in a slow puff, settling on her skirt like pale ash. Her fingers traced the carved symbol once, then fell away. The mark burned under her touch, not hot, but present like a brand she could not erase. Far down the valley, a thin column of dust rose. Cavalry mounts moving slow along the boundary ridge. Lanterns were not needed in daylight, but she caught the glint of metal bridle buckles, carbine barrels catching sun. Captain Slade's patrol. They had not seen her yet. The wind was wrong. But sound carried far in these canyons. One pushed stone, one sharp crack, and they would turn. Behind her, the Mustangs had followed at a distance. Storm circled the base of the rock pile, nostrils, wide head low to the ground. He snorted once soft, then again frustration, not anger. The others bunched tighter, flanks heaving. No water in the troughs back at the ranch. The barrels were down to half. Willow stood patient, but her ribs showed sharper than yesterday. Clara reached into the saddlebag and pulled the last canteen. She poured a measured stream into her hat brim for Willow. The mare drank in slow gulps, lips working the tin. Clara watched the level drop. When the hat was empty, she stoppered the canteen. It sloshed light in her hand, barely enough for herself through tomorrow. She rose. Her shadow fell across the blocked entrance, long and thin. She set both hands against the topmost boulder, shoulders braced. The stone did not budge. She pushed harder. A small pebble shifted, rattled down the pile. The sound echoed once sharp, then died. She let her hands fall. Sweat stung the corner of her eye. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist. On the opposite ridge, old white feather appeared small against the sky blanket draped over one shoulder. He did not move closer. He simply stood, watching. Clara looked at him a long moment. Then she turned her back on the blocked spring. She gathered Willow's reins and mounted without hurry. The mare's sides were warm against her legs, trembling faintly from thirst. The Mustangs began to drift east, slow heads low, following the scent of whatever water might still lie that way. Storm led without looking back. Clara sat the saddle a beat longer. She glanced once more at the carved stone at the old man on the ridge. Then she nudged Willow forward. The canyon swallowed the sound of hooves. Behind her, the blocked entrance waited silent, the water inside still running for no one. The sun dropped behind the western mesas like a spent cartridge leaving the valley floor in bruised purple shadow. Clara stood in the middle of the yard, boots planted wide in the dust that still held the day's heat. The Mustangs had come in on their own, slow heads, low flanks, sunken from thirst. They circled her without pressing close, a loose ring of dark shapes breathing in short, ragged pulls. Storm stood nearest, black coat dull under the fading light, nostrils flared at the scent of her sweat and resolve. She drew Talon's knife from the sheath at her belt. The curved blade caught the last red streak of sunset glinting once before she turned it inward. No hesitation in the motion, only a deliberate slowness. She gathered a thick strand of hair at her nape, dark dust-streaked longer than it had been since Eli's burying, and brought the edge across. The cut was clean quiet. A soft snip, then the weight of the lock fell into her palm. She did not flinch at the sudden lightness at the back of her head. She selected a small, flat stone from the ground near her boot, smooth river rock no bigger than her fist. With careful fingers, she bound the hair around it, knotting the strands tight so they would not slip. The knot was simple, no flourish. When it was done, she walked to the mouth of the narrow trail that led toward the blocked spring. The pile of boulders waited there, silent accusation under the climbing dusk. Clara knelt. She placed the stone on the flat top of the largest boulder, right beside the pecked sign of prohibition. The hair fluttered once in the evening breath, then settled. She did not speak. She did not pray. She simply rose and stepped back, letting the axe stand between her and the stone. From the eastern ridge lanterns bloomed 3, then 4 yellow eyes swinging low across the hardpan. The soft jingle of bit and spur carried ahead of the hoofbeats. Captain Slade's voice drifted first, calm, almost conversational. "Mrs. Hayes, step clear of those animals." Harlan Crow rode beside him, coat open against the cooling air, one hand resting on the pommel of a borrowed revolver. He pointed toward the herd fingers steady. "They're reservation stock. You know the papers." Clara did not answer. She turned her face toward the Mustangs. Storm shifted closer, shoulder brushing her arm, warm, solid, the first time he had done so since the circle was broken. The others held their places, ears flicking between her and the approaching lights. High on the opposite hill, a small group of Apache shapes stood dark against the sky, old white feather. Among them, blanket-wrapped close staff planted like a marker. They did not move down. They did not call out. They watched. Clara exhaled once long and slow. The knife was still in her hand. She sheathed it without looking down. The lanterns drew nearer. Hooves struck stone now, sharp and deliberate. Slade reined in 20 yards, out horse-sidling at the scent of the herd. Clara took one step forward, placing herself between the riders and the Mustangs. Her voice came clear, not loud, but carrying the full distance. "These horses are not yours to take." Storm lifted his head high beside her ears, forward black mane stirring in the faint night wind. The herd tightened behind them, quiet, watchful. Old White Feather inclined his head once from the ridge, small measured the motion of a man who has seen what he came to see. The lanterns halted. Slade's horse blew softly. Harlan Crow's hand drifted toward his revolver, then paused. Clara stood motionless in the gathering dark. The Mustangs did not scatter. The Apache on the hill did not descend. Hoofbeats resumed slow, deliberate, closing the last of the ground between them. The first light of morning came gray and thin, spilling over the rim of the valley, like spilled lead. Clara stood in the center of the yard, boots sunk in dust, still damp from night dew. The Mustangs had gathered around her, during the dark hours close, but not crowding. They stood quiet heads, low flanks rising and falling in slow rhythm. Storm positioned himself at the heart of the ring, black coat catching the pale dawn like wet coal. No one moved. No one grazed. They waited. Clara's breath came visible in short, even puffs. The cut hair at her nape felt strange, lighter, colder against the collar of her shirt. She did not touch it. A shadow detached from the eastern rise. Old White Feather walked down the slope, a lone blanket folded over one arm, steps measured and unhurried. In his free hand, he carried a small deerskin pouch, tied at the neck with sinew. He stopped 10 paces from Clara, set the pouch on the ground between them, and straightened. No greeting, no words. He simply looked at her, then passed her to Storm. The black stallion lifted his head. Ears flicked forward once, then settled. A low murmur passed through the herd, soft, almost inaudible. They shifted weight hooves, scraping dry earth. A few heads turned toward the old man. Not all, but enough. Clara stared at the pouch. It lay small and dark against the pale ground laces, frayed the leather stained from long use. She knew what it held without opening it, earth from a sacred place, perhaps a pinch of pollen or ash eagle down folded inside. Things meant to carry memory across generations. Things she had no right to touch. From the valley mouth, the sound of iron shoes returned, slow, deliberate. Lanterns were not needed now. The riders came in plain sight. Captain Slade at the front, Harlan Crow beside him, coat flapping open. Behind them, 2 troopers carried rolled papers tied with red tape orders, warrants, claims. Slade reined in at the edge of the yard. His horse blew once, steam curling from nostrils. Harlan pointed a gloved finger toward the herd. "Those animals are reservation property. You've been told?" Clara did not answer. She looked down at the pouch again. The Mustangs stirred slow, uncertain. A bay mare took 1 step toward Old White Feather, then stopped. Storm remained rooted beside Clara, but his head lowered a fraction, nostrils working the air between the 2 figures. Old White Feather did not glance at her. His eyes stayed on Storm. The stallion met the gaze for a long beat, then looked away toward the east, toward the blocked spring, toward whatever lay beyond the ridge. Clara's throat worked once. She knelt slowly, knees pressing into the dirt. Her fingers hovered above the pouch, then settled on the soft leather. It was warm from the old man's hand. She did not open it. Old White Feather spoke then, voice low, rough as dry gravel. "Ancestors do not forgive those who keep what must be returned." 1 sentence. No more. He turned. The blanket shifted across his shoulders as he walked back up the rise. The herd watched him go. A few horses followed a step or 2, hesitant heads low, then stopped. Storm stayed where he was, but his ears flicked backward. Clara rose. She lifted the pouch in both hands, fingers closing tight around it. The deerskin felt heavy, too heavy for what it held. Hooves struck the hardpan again. Slade's mount sidled forward. Harlan's glove tightened on his reins. Clara stood motionless between the riders and the herd. The pouch rested against her chest. The Mustangs went still, completely still, no sound, but the slow draw of breath through wide nostrils. The valley held its silence, like a held breath. No wind rose. No bird crossed the sky. only the slow advance of iron shoes on the dry earth coming closer. The sun bled low across the valley, painting the dust gold, and the shadows long and black. Clara stood at the center of the yard, the pouch of sacred earth pressed against her ribs, Talon's knife heavy in her right hand. The Mustangs formed a ragged half-circle behind her, Storm at the forehead, high ears pinned forward. No wind stirred. The air tasted of dry grass and horse sweat, and the faint iron tang of coming night. Captain Slade reined in at the yard's edge, horse sidling against the press of the herd. Harlan Crow rode beside him, face flushed beneath the brim of his hat, one hand already on the coiled rope at his saddle. 4 troopers fanned out carbines across Pommel's eyes, hard on the black stallion and the woman who stood with him. "Step aside, Mrs. Hayes," Slade said, voice flat, practiced. "We've got orders. Those horses go back to the reservation." Harlan leaned forward in the stirrups. "You've harbored a renegade. That's enough to hang a man or woman." Clara did not move. Her thumb traced the antler handle once slow. The pouch warmed against her chest, like a second heartbeat. From the west, a single rider appeared, quiet, unhurried, cutting across the open ground behind the troopers. Doc Evelyn Shaw rode a plain bay gelding saddlebags, heavy with rolled papers. She pulled up short of the line, dismounted without flourish, and walked straight through the gap the troopers left. No one stopped her. She stopped beside Clara, close enough that their shadows merged on the dust. Without preamble, she drew a thin sheaf of documents from her coat official seal's ink, still fresh, and held them out to Slade. "These are from Washington," she said. "Agent Crow is relieved of duty. Pending investigation, the charges are embezzlement of rations, falsified ledgers, and diversion of tribal assets." "You'll read them, Captain, or I'll read them for you." Slade took the papers. His jaw tightened as he scanned the first page. Harlan's face went the color of old parchment. "This is a forgery," Harlan barked. "She's lying, that woman." 2 troopers moved before Slade could speak. One caught Harlan's wrist as he reached for his sidearm. The other snapped cuffs on with a metallic click that carried across the yard. Harlan twisted voice, rising sharp and thin. "This woman harbored a renegade. She's protecting stolen stock." Slade raised a hand. The troopers paused. He finished reading, then folded the papers once and tucked them inside his tunic. "Stand down," he told his men. To Harlan, "You'll come with us." Quietly. Harlan's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then he spat into the dust. Clara watched it all without expression. Her eyes drifted past the riders to the ridge. Old white feathers stood there, still small against the sky blanket wrapped close. He did not descend. He did not speak. He only watched, steady, unblinking, as Harlan was pulled from the saddle and led away. The Mustangs stirred. Storm took one step toward Clara, then halted. A few mares drifted east, heads low, then stopped again, caught between the woman and the old man on the hill. The herd held its place, but the unity was frayed. In the sudden quiet, a horse squealed, sharp, startled. Willow had been pushed aside in the press of mounts. A trooper's iron-shod hoof had raked a shallow gash along her near shoulder. Blood welled dark against the dun coat. The mare trembled, but did not bolt. Clara knelt beside her, without a word. She tore a strip from the hem of her skirt, pressed it to the wound. The cloth soaked red at once. Willow snorted once, soft, pained. Clara's hand stayed steady, but her breathing came shorter. Doc Evelyn Shaw stepped closer. Mrs. Hayes, Clara did not look up. She kept pressure on the cut fingers slick with blood. Doc Evelyn held out the papers again toward Slade this time. "Agent Crow is relieved of duty," she repeated, voice even. "The horses stay here, for now." Slade nodded, once curt. The troopers mounted. Harlan was hoisted behind one of them wrists, bound head down. They turned east without another word. Clara finished binding the wound. She rose slowly, hand still on Willow's neck. The mare leaned into her touch, but the weight felt different, less certain. Old White Feather turned. He walked away along the ridge staff, tapping once against stone. The Apache shapes with him followed without hurry. They vanished over the crest. The Mustangs stood silent. No nickers, no restless shifting. Only the low rasp of breath in wide nostrils. Clara looked at the empty ridge a long moment. Then she turned back to the yard. The pouch of earth still hung against her chest. The knife was back in its sheath. Willow's blood stained her skirt dark. The valley settled into dusk. No one spoke. The silence pressed heavier than the coming night. A few days passed under a sky that refused to rain again. Clara climbed the low hill alone at mid-morning, the same rise where Old White Feather had last stood. The grass was still short, brittle under her boots, and the wind carried the faint smell of sagebrush and distant horse sweat. She sat on a flat rock that overlooked the ranch yard. Below the cabin, unchanged, the corrals fuller now, the Mustangs moving slow in the heat. Storm grazed apart from the others, Black Coat dull in the harsh light. He no longer lifted his head when she appeared on the ridge. The herd had settled into new patterns, mares bunched tighter colts, trailing close. But the old rhythm was gone. No stallion called them forward. No one led. Clara's fingers drifted to the fresh scar on the back of her hand, and the thin line left when Willow's wound had finally closed. The skin there pulled tight when she flexed her fingers, a small, constant reminder. She traced it once slow, then let her hand fall. Below, Doc Evelyn Shaw moved between the barn and the new lean-to she had started framing. Hammer strikes rang out sharp, irregular, then stopped. The woman paused, wiped her brow with a sleeve, and looked up toward the hill. Clara did not wave. Doc Evelyn did not call out. She simply returned to work. No Apache shapes dotted the horizon, no blanket-wrapped figures on the ridges. They had left without sound or sign, the way smoke leaves a cold fire. No farewell, no tracks to follow. Clara watched the Mustangs longer than she meant to. Ember drifted near the water trough, then shied when Clara's shadow fell across the yard below. The russet mare backed away, ears flat, and rejoined the others. Willow stood farther off, head low, the scar on her shoulder already fading to white hair. When Clara had approached the corral yesterday, both mares had turned their hindquarters, quiet refusal, no violence, just distance. She exhaled once, long and slow. The pouch of sacred earth still hung inside her shirt against her skin. She had not opened it. She had not returned it. It rested there like a stone she could not dislodge. A single red-tailed hawk circled high overhead once, twice, then tilted away toward the east. The same direction Talon had ridden. The same direction the herd had started drifting the night the soldiers came. Clara stood. Dust sifted from her skirt. She looked east a long moment, past the mesas, past the place where the blocked spring lay hidden. The land stretched empty. I kept the word she said, voice so low it barely stirred the air. But not enough. No answer came. Old White Feather was not there to hear it. She turned down slope. Her boots scuffed the dry earth. The knife at her belt shifted once against her hip, familiar weight, familiar curve. The scar on her hand pulled as she gripped the hilt for a second, then released. In the yard below, the Mustangs lifted heads as she approached. They did not scatter. They did not come closer. They simply watched, quiet, steady breathing in the same measured rhythm. Clara walked among them without speaking. Storm remained apart, grazing alone. The others shifted to let her pass flanks, brushing close, but never touching. No knickers, no restless stamping. Only the soft rasp of breath and the slow scrape of hooves on hard ground. She reached the porch and stopped. The hawk was gone now. The valley lay still under the climbing sun. Clara rested one hand on the railing's scarred palm flat against the sun-bleached wood. The Mustangs stood behind her, silent as shadows. They followed at a distance when she finally stepped inside, but the space between them felt wider than the yard itself. The highest hill above Salvation Valley caught the first pale edge of dawn, a thin line of light that did not warm. Clara stood alone on the crest, far enough from the ranch that the cabin below looked small as a child's drawing. The wind had died in the night. Now it rose again, slow and deliberate, carrying the dry scent of sage and distant rain that had never quite arrived. In her left hand, she held Talon's knife blade-sheathed antler handle warm from her grip. In her right, the lock of hair she had cut days before, still tied to its small stone edges frayed from carrying. Before her lay a rough circle of stones she had gathered and placed herself, not the perfect symmetry Talon once showed her. Not the measured spacing old White Feather would have known. Only memory pieced together from watching from silence. The circle was small, incomplete, one gap wide enough for a hand to pass through. She knelt. The earth under her knees was hard cracked despite the recent rain, as though the ground itself refused to forget drought. She set the stone with its bound hair in the center. Then she reached up, gathered another small strand at her temple, short, now uneven, and brought the knife across. The cut was quiet. The hair fell into her palm, dark against the pale skin. She laid it beside the first crossed once and let both rest on the bare dirt inside the ring. No words came, no prayer. She simply sat back on her heels and looked east toward the blue haze of mountains, where Talon had ridden away on rusty 30 wild horses trailing like smoke. The horizon held nothing now but empty sky. Far below the ranch lay quiet. The new lean-to Doc Evelyn had framed stood half-finished beside the barn. No hammer rang this early. No figures moved in the yard. The woman from Washington had stayed papers spread on the table inside plans for a center that would carry names and knowledge on paper instead of in ceremony, but the ridges remained empty. No blankets, no staff tapping stone. The Apache had gone without trace. The Mustangs grazed in the basin at the hill's foot. Storm stood a little apart, head-low black coat catching the strengthening light. He did not look up. Ember and Willow drifted near the dry creek bed, then veered away when Clara's shadow fell long across the slope. They moved without hurry, without sound. Clara rose. She lifted the knife, turned it once in the light. The turquoise inlay caught a single spark, then died. She stepped forward and placed the sheathed blade in the center of the circle blade, pointed east handle toward the gap she had left. She did not close the ring. The space remained open, deliberate. She stood a long moment, hands empty now, scar on her palm pulling tight in the cool air. The wind strengthened, lifting dust in the small spirals around the stones. It tugged at her shortened hair, at the hem of her skirt, at the loose earth inside the unfinished circle. A single red-tailed hawk rose from the far ridge wings, set circling once above the valley, then tilted away and vanished into the east. Clara turned. She started down the slope without looking back. Her boots scuffed soft against dry grass. Behind her, the Mustangs lifted heads. Storm took one step, then another. The herd followed slow, unhurried hooves, barely stirring dust. They kept distant shadows trailing hers down the hill, but no knickers rose. No eager press. Only the steady rhythm of breath and footfall. The wind carried on low and persistent, scattering fine grit across the open circle she had left behind. The knife lay still in its place. The gap waited. No one appeared on the ridge to see it. No voice broke the quiet. The valley held its breath as the light climbed higher and the day began again. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.